Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Dr. Jennifer Raymond. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you because your work with unconscious bias is one of the problems that's just dividing our country, and that you have dedicated your life to work in neurobiology. You are at Stanford University. Tell us what neurobiology is, if you'd be so kind.
Neurobiology is the study of how the brain processes, stores, and uses information to guide our behavior.
And you're involved in more than just neurobiology because you're part of a program called BioX, an interdisciplinary
That's right.
project at Stanford University using many other approaches to bringing all this scientific knowledge together.
Neuroscience itself is interdisciplinary, and it's becoming more so. We're engaging people from the law school, the business school, from the engineering school.
And your own lab studies the neural mechanisms of learning.
That's right.
How did you come into this line of work? What drew you to this?
Oh, gosh, I think it's just the most interesting question I can possibly go after. And so I got advice from my stepfather-in-law, who is a professor at Berkeley, and he said, Jennifer, you just pick the most exciting problem and you go after it. And well, that's what I've done.
This is the most exciting problem. You're speaking tonight on something called unconscious bias, why we all have it, and what can we do about it. So tell me, what is unconscious bias, and how can we discover it if it's unconscious?
Unconscious bias is a tendency we have to prefer one thing over another, often without us explicitly knowing that we do. And there's a test that you can use to experience your own unconscious biases. It's called the implicit association test. It was developed by researchers at Harvard. And you can go to their website and take their test. It can test all different kinds of biases. One is a preference for seeing science as something that's male rather than female. And it measures your time to associate different concepts. And most people have a tendency to associate men with science and women with not science.
Right, and I've taken some of those tests, and I found them very uncomfortable. They want you to go fast so that you're really not filtering things intellectually. It's a gut level thing, which is a way to get into that unconscious bias. Some of your sponsors for this event are the Women's International Study Center, and they are doing a whole series called the Dialogue on Gender Equity. Also, the Santa Fe Institute is another sponsor. But gender equity, well, there's so many. We're going to talk about lots of biases in the time that we are allowed, but let's talk about gender equity, and particularly in science. You're a woman in science. What happened when you took the implicit assessment about bias toward women in science?
Well, I knew going into the test that a vast majority of people have a tendency, a bias, to view science as something that's for men. And yet, I was hoping that I might not. And it's true that men and women both have the same biases. We're all part of the same culture. We acquire this by observing what's happening around us, by seeing the images in books and in the media. And so I knew it was likely I'd have one, but I was hoping I wouldn't, and yet I didn't even need to wait for my score. I could feel that it was harder for me to associate women with science.
It's in the news lately that a Nobel laureate talked about how women scientists are trouble in the lab. He said he was joking, but it really hit a hot button for a lot of people.
Unfortunately, explicit sexism is not extinct, but it's really less of an influence now. And most people think that this more pervasive, unconscious, unintended bias is really what's the main factor holding women back at this point.
There have been a lot of tests. A friend of my daughter's had actually changed her first name from a very female-sounding name to a very neutral name in order to get published, in order to get ahead. So that's pretty explicit.
My department chair is transgender, and he changed from a female scientist to a male scientist. And he said his experience was radically different as a male scientist. He was taken more seriously. He was allowed to finish his sentences without being interrupted. And soon after he changed, a friend actually overheard someone after he gave a lecture saying, wow, his work is better than his sister's. So from people who are transgender actually can offer pretty interesting personal insights into how different the experience of the same person is when they present as male versus female.
Well, they have done, of course, I love that this is so tested, but to analyze a female professor's work as opposed to a male, even in terms of how long it took her to get the papers back, the same person, but as a woman, they said it took longer, and as a man, they said it was efficient. And I mean, and then you even talk about at your own university, the halls with the photographs of the male Nobel laureates. And how many women have there been?
Well, these are Stanford Nobel laureates,
yes,
and there have been 0 Nobel laureates from Stanford who are women. So one of the unfortunate things is because women have the same biases that men do, we can tend to turn our tendency to view women as less competent against ourselves. And this can cause self-doubt, and also it can even decrease performance. If you take an Asian woman and remind her before she takes a math test that she's Asian, she does better than if you remind her before the test that she's a woman. Because the stereotype is that Asians are good at math and women are bad at math. So it doesn't just create self-doubts that might ultimately lead to women opting out, but it actually can affect performance. So gender bias is a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways.
And you had mentioned that it was getting up to where maybe 50% of the students were female, but they would drop out at the postdoc level.
That's right. In my field, which is neuroscience, we have a better pipeline for women than in many of the sciences. And yet, at that transition from getting the PhD, which is a lot of work, to the postdoc, the next stage in the career track, we're losing women at the national level at almost twice the rate as men. And so, and then they just drop off progressively as you go up the ladder.
So this affects many other areas. For example, mentoring. You've got a bright young student. More men are mentored. More male students are mentored than female students. Salary issues, retention, tenure. This is so pervasive. And then there's a famous glass ceiling in business. The same ceiling exists in the sciences too, doesn't it?
That's right. And more disturbing than some of the absolute numbers about what is the wage gap, or how many women are there on boards of Fortune 500 companies, is the trends, which are flattening off. In the 80s and 90s, we were making a lot of progress. Women were catching up. But in the last decade or two, there's been much less progress. So, for example, the number of women on Fortune 500 boards has shown almost no change over the last decade. There's been no change in neuroscience postdocs in the last decade. Even though we have this great pipeline, we've flattened out. And in computer science, there's actually been a backslide. The highest percentage of computer science degrees going to women happened in the 80s, when 38% of degrees went to women. Now we're at about 18% nationally.
And now there's actually a vicious backlash against female computer geeks in the gaming world and all that. I mean, it's so 1950s.
Yes. So explicit sexism is not dead, but even the people who really mean well. I mean, and I think most people at this point mean well. They want to treat women fairly. They want to give them an equal chance. And yet wanting that to be so doesn't make it so, because we have these unconscious biases that are sometimes at odds with our conscious beliefs.
So the issue is how to discover these unconscious biases against women or other things that we're biased against, and how to fight them. And you say that everyone wants to be fair and do the right thing. This was in one of your articles. The research shows that the fairer you think you are, probably the more biased you are. Can you speak to that?
That's right. So in particular, there was one study by Ullman and Cohen who showed that people tend to value whatever characteristic a male job candidate has. They did a study where it was a police chief And if it was the male candidate that had more education, people thought education was more important. And if it was the female candidate who had the education, people thought education was less important. So our rational brain does a great job of making excuses for the decisions that are being driven by our unconscious biases. It's the bias that we think a police chief that should be a man that causes most people to choose the man. But then we make excuses that sound pretty rational. And they found that the tendency to do that, to shift your criteria, change your criteria to favor whatever criteria the male candidate has, is higher if you think you're more objective. And so it's sort of like you have to be aware and vigilant in order to be able to use conscious strategies to suppress your bias. And it's kind of like a mental habit, right? The unconscious bias, this is the thinking fast, if you're aware of the Kahneman thinking fast, thinking slow. And so that can drive your behavior if you let it, but you can also use more conscious strategies. Just like if you have a bad habit of biting your nails, you can develop strategies to suppress that habit.
Well, please tell us some of those strategies, because when I took these tests, it was very uncomfortable. I was actually quite angry and disrespected the tests until I got to the third or fourth one, and I realized kind of what was going on, but it really plugged me in. So I have as I myself have looked for some of these answers, there are ways of creating scenarios or tableaus starring the people that you're biased against in your own mind, and trying to, but you, I'm sure, give us some advice on how to identify our biases and how to fight them.
Well, one way to really experience it, as you describe, is to take that test and to feel, that even though you didn't think you had that bias in you, you can experience it, and just that experience alone can motivate people to want to take action. It's very hard to get rid of that unconscious bias. This is created by years and years of the images we've been surrounded by. So you can try to gradually change it by exposing yourself to different images, focusing on images of women. Writers can create more strong female characters. We can look to female role models. But in the meantime, we just need to find strategies to put the bias aside, recognize it, and then say, okay, here's a situation where that bias might creep out unless I'm really wary of it. And so usually bias has more effect if it's a hurried decision. Your gut feeling, that quick decision, is the one that tends to be dominated by bias. And so you want to take your time, look at the data, set your criteria in advance if you're going to be evaluating people. My department chair said he uses a conscious strategy if we're more likely. We know when boys raise their hands, we're more likely to call on them if we're a teacher. And when he gives a lecture, he uses the strategy to just alternate male-female when he calls for questions. So you can use simple strategies sometimes. If you can see what your biases might be, you can design strategies to suppress their effects.
What is the role of the media? Because the media feeds us images all the time.
That's right. So our biases don't necessarily even reflect our own experience. So my daughter took the implicit association test, and she had a tendency to view careers as something that's more for men than women, even though she has a mom who probably works longer hours than her dad. So and all of her friends, most of her friends' moms work. So, her direct experience might not have created that bias. But if you read the books that have been written over the last several decades, if you watch movies, even today, male characters dominate. And more of the characters that are out with careers that we're exposed to in the media are male characters. So there's an effort now. Gina Davis has been working to try to increase the representation of strong female characters in the media, but it's still dominated by men.
We're speaking today with Dr. Jennifer Raymond. Thank you for joining us. I am tantalized with the way bias is actually affecting our nation and our politics and our history. I'd like you to talk about race and unconscious bias in race.
Sure. We have many biases. One is to view women as more competent. We also view people more competent if they have light skin, if they're taller, if they're thinner, if they're younger. So there are many biases, and I think we'll find a lot of commonalities in terms of understanding where these biases come from and strategies to suppress their effects and ultimately eliminate them. But there are also some differences between gender and race. There's something called benevolent sexism, where, there's a lot of fraternizing with the enemy, right? It's not an enemy. But women are seen as wonderful but weak, and that's part of the courtship ritual that we've developed, and that's part of what we need to change. So there's a lot of commonalities, and there are also some differences for men and women. There's more interactions between men and women than between races.
I was interested in one of the tests was a weapons identification test. The person, be either white or dark skin, would be holding an object, perhaps a gun, perhaps a wallet, perhaps a spoon. I mean, and in a flash, you have to determine if for the police it's to shoot or not shoot. And it was, astonishing how many police, again, in that high pressure situation, would shoot first and find out later it was a 12-year-old kid or something.
Yeah, and here's another difference between racial bias and gender bias. A lot of the, as I said, it's those quick decisions, that gut reaction that tends to be dominated by your bias. And so in a lot of the cases for gender, we can combat that by slowing down and taking just a little more time to make a decision. But in the case of police brutality, it's going to be more difficult because they're forced into the situation of making quick decisions. But still, there's some evidence that creating procedures that become habitual can help to mitigate the effects of bias. And this is an active area of research. We don't have all the answers, but there's ongoing research that's going to be really important for allowing us to be who we want to be.
Well, we see it in the media. For example, the arrest of Dylan Roof after shooting 9 people in the church, and the arrest of Eric Garner for selling loose cigarettes. They take him down, choke him, and kill him. The other kid, they just walk away. It's just, we're being fed images like this all the time. There's two sides of it, too. How do you deal if you're a member of the discriminated class? How do you deal with that? And
Yes.
African-American parents have to have the talk with their young men
Yes.
because they're so vulnerable. And then how do you feel if you are the bearer of that unconscious bias without knowing it? How do you deal with that? But talk to me about how a member of a discriminated class, like young black men, how can they overcome those biases against them?
Yeah, so that's right. There's the survival strategies, and for the person who's being discriminated against, this is the Band-Aid. This is not the solution. And this is actually where we've seen the most work in dealing with gender bias. But, it tends to be to downplay the characteristic that you're getting discriminated against for having, and that's denying people the ability to be who they are and still succeed. So that's not a solution. Those are Band-Aids that can help people get by. And so we really need to work on individuals taking responsibility for recognizing their biases and suppressing them, and for institutions stepping up and investing in educating everyone in their organization and providing incentives for people throughout an organization to engage in thinking about how we can mitigate bias. I think if you ask a lot of people and you say who's responsible for dealing with bias or diversity issues in your organization, they'll say, oh yeah, we have a diversity office, or it's the HR people or the dean's office. But the way bias works is in the everyday interactions. And so we need people on the ground, in the trenches, in the important meetings, on the streets, who are educated about these issues, knowledgeable, and willing to step in and intervene when they see a problem. And
you're on the diversity committee at Stanford, aren't you? You're looking for those biases. You're helping this large institution work with that.
Yes.
So one of the things an illustration I saw is a sketch of a cat that ultimately through several changes becomes a dog, and yet people do not want to see that it's a dog. They still call it a cat. Now, there's a new category of exempt persons, young white men, and they're treated so differently from young black men, but Sandy Hook, the Boston Marathon, the Denver Theater, the Charleston Church, Columbine, those are all young white men, and yet we are still seeing a cat instead of a dog. How does that group lose their exempt status? When is finally the penny going to drop and people realize, wait a minute, these people all have something in common?
It's very difficult to change these. They're culturally transmitted. So, I was very aware of gender when I was bringing up my kids and tried to bring them up for, to view men and women as equal. And yet when my daughter, and I changed the names of characters in books, and I made an effort at the park to say, look at the squirrel, she's gathering nuts half of the time. And yet when my daughter was 3, she was on the play structure, she said, this is a ship, I'm the captain, I'm a girl captain. And so despite even, what some might say extreme efforts that I made, she absorbed from the culture around her. It's very difficult to isolate people and control what they're exposed to when it's so embedded in our culture. And so these are going to be things that are not going to change easily on their own. We're going to really have to commit to making an effort to changing them.
I'm so grateful for your work. There are so many other biases we're not going to take the time for, but the young and old, gay and straight, professional, blue collar. I mean, by the time you do all these, you just go, oh my, I'm doomed. I'm not even a person anymore. I'm just a stimulus response animal responding to all these biases. And it is kind of horrifying to know how these unconscious things guide us. I, too, urge people to take those implicit assessment tests, but they're very uncomfortable. There's no way around that. And Harvard University is doing that. Are there any other tests? Are there any other ways, besides trying to really be open and aware of why we do what we do?
That's one of the best ones. People also are trying to design quicker tests, quicker ways to allow people to experience their bias. And one is a riddle about father and son were in a car accident, and they get rushed to the hospital, and they bring the son into the operating room, and the surgeon says, I cannot operate on this child, he's my son. And it takes a while for people to figure out that it might have been his mother, or maybe it was his other dad. And so I think more of these kinds of riddles that just allow people to have that quick experience of, oh, I was making assumptions that maybe I don't even really explicitly endorse.
But riddles in the history of spiritual evolution and in storytelling, it's always like Jesus' parables is in koan. What is his hand of one hand clapping? When you try to figure it out, you realize, and a new thing is possible. So I'm delighted that you use riddles because as your brain, you've got a dissonant thing here and you try to put it together and it's it's real aha moments. What else can we, just the ordinary person, do to look at to discover our own unconscious biases?
Those are the biggies. But there are a lot of things people can do once you're aware to start noticing what's happening, monitoring your own behavior. So, knowing the study that shows that professors have a tendency to offer more mentoring to male versus female students, I monitor that behavior very carefully, and I still catch myself slipping up and try to correct it. So once you kind of know what the patterns might be and you kind of analyze where you're most vulnerable, you can start to notice and correct.
And I think even reading about these experiments, there was one with a symphony orchestra where we're looking for new musicians, and when they had the musicians just play behind a screen where you couldn't tell whether it was a male or female playing the instrument, suddenly a whole lot more women got inducted into the orchestra.
That's a very powerful example, because a lot of the work, the evidence for bias has come from laboratory studies or some kind of field study, but there's a really natural situation where as soon as people couldn't see who was playing, suddenly the music sounded better, not knowing that it was coming from a woman.
Are there any other examples besides the music and then scientists changing their names, writers changing their name? J.K. Rowling said she put out Harry Potter under that you couldn't tell whether it was male or female, just the initials, and that she felt she got a better hearing for her work.
Yeah, often it's difficult to completely mask your characteristics. But one nice real world example came from these MOOCs, these large online courses, where they had the very same professors either present to the students, present to half of their students as male versus female, and that's when they're evaluated totally differently for the same performance. So that's more of a real world experiment too, where you have large numbers and you can see, it's a real teaching situation, rated as a better teacher and rated better on many aspects of their teaching if they presented as male. And those are male and female teachers presenting as both.
That's when it really struck me, because one of the things they were graded on was how rapidly they got the work back. And it was exactly the same. But when it was a woman, they thought it took longer.
Mm-hmm.
And then
I've heard a really nice analogy that women are running on a faster treadmill. The treadmill's going a little faster, maybe a lot faster sometimes. And so they have to run harder just to be rated as the same.
So, in effect, what we can do about it is to be more aware and to look for those gut feelings when we just have
Be suspicious of your gut feelings. Use data to the extent possible. Take your time and be as analytical as you can when you make decisions. And then I think another important one is that we know everyone has a tendency, most people overwhelmingly have a tendency to offer encouragement to boys over girls and to women over men. And so if we could each be aware that that's one that we're likely to have and make that extra effort to offer the same encouragement and positive feedback that we would naturally give to a boy, I think that can go a long way too.
well, it's a little bit like turning an oil tanker.
Yes.
It's just going to take generations. Is there a way we can jumpstart this? We have all this science, we have all this media at our disposal. Is there any way we could head this off at the pass?
I hope so, because the trends right now suggest that we're not on a trajectory to reach gender parity for anybody who's alive right now, not our daughters, not our granddaughters, maybe not even our great-great-granddaughters. When I took the numbers for women in neuroscience at the assistant professor level, kind of mid-career, and just extrapolated out, if we continue on the same trajectory, we won't get to 50-50 until 2117. And I am not nearly that patient, so I am very hopeful that we, by each taking small actions and institutions stepping up and investing more in this issue, that we will be able to turn the tanker. And there's a lot to be gained from this investment, because we know there's some studies showing very beautifully how we're losing some of the top talent. A big part of the top part of the talent pool is female, and we're losing a large fraction of them. And so when we lose them, we lose also the discoveries they would have made, the cures for diseases they would have found, the inventions they would have made, the solutions for problems of society, the art they would have produced. We know that companies that have more women tend to be more profitable. So there's a lot of evidence that if people step up and invest, there will be a big return on that.
Well, we're out of time. I have to leave it there. But it is because of you, Dr. Jennifer Raymond, our guest today, and the work that you're doing in exposing unconscious bias, that you're going to help turn that oil tanker faster. So I'm very grateful to you coming here to report from Santa Fe and sharing your work with us. I hope you come back again.
Thank you very much.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for looking at your unconscious biases with us today on Report from Santa Fe. Thank you.
Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.